The following review of Clair Obscur Expédition 33 contains spoilers for the entirety of the game. Continue watching at your own risk. You might be initially tempted to think that Expédition 33 is a game about sacrifice, hence the often quoted "for those who come after" motto. For the first two acts of the game, this actually seems to be true, but strangely, the story doesn't push those concepts as far as you might think. With a literal ticking clock over everyone's head and the pressure to keep humanity alive, you would think that age and even parenthood or gender would be important topics and themes during these first two acts, and, well, they sort of are during our time as Gustave in Lumière. We get a glimpse of a game that actually cares about these sorts of ethical dilemmas, which would actually be quite relevant given the disposition of Gustave's 16-year-old foster sister, Maëlle. The game's focus lies elsewhere, however, and for good reason. Once we arrive at the continent, it's clear that the game would rather focus around themes of death, of loss, but most importantly of sacrifice for the greater good of humanity. This is unfortunately where the issues of Clair Obscur Expédition 33's choice of gameplay become all too clear. As a JRPG, it follows a familiar format: walk forward, get touched by enemy, get teleported to an arena, fight, repeat. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with this kind of gameplay. It's even worth mentioning that this game does something substantially better than most of its peers. It has very little filler type content, and almost none of said content is obligatory. The game's length is remarkably short, which ensures it doesn't overstay its welcome. The side content is mostly set up for the end of the game, as to not ruin the first two acts' spacing and even reinforce the themes of escapism that become very apparent later on. Finally, the soundtrack is an all-timer, and the game looks distinct from other JRPGs by using a more realistic art style. The combat also has many aspects worth praising. The animations are detailed and have a true sense of weight, while the particle effects are visually impressive. Mechanically, it brings a few novel things to the table, notably aiming, which can be used for certain gimmicks, weak points, but even to create entire builds. Other notable additions include dodging and parrying, which turns the defensive play of turn-based combat from passive to active. The way skills are designed, they incentivize planning and cunning, but at the start at least, they heavily favor certain types of play, with fire builds being by far the most viable. Once the player finally finds their ideal build, they'll inevitably fall into a routine where they repeat the same setup in order to deliver the same punchline. Over and over and over again. Once you find a comfortable strategy that you find particularly strong, there's almost never a reason to deviate from it, and so the player eventually goes on autopilot. There are exceptions to this. If an enemy absorbs or nullifies an element, or if an Evron like the Bourgeon eats one of your companions, it can seriously shake up an encounter and make it more interesting. But those moments are few and far between. In those scenarios where the game becomes too mindless, the player will have to be the one to shake up the experience for themselves by changing builds or imposing limitations if they want to be more engaged. Consequently, the game ends up relying on its defensive play in order to keep the player on their toes, but that aspect of combat has problems of its own. Aside from the fairly small difference between the dodge and the parry window, this kind of gameplay simply isn't very interesting. Now, there's no denying that the delayed attack patterns and memorization-focused defensive gameplay of Clair Obscur was influenced by the likes of the Souls series, but unfortunately there's simply none of the depth that comes with said defensive play in those titles. In, for example, Elden Ring, blocking and dodging have two distinct functions. One lets you stand still, the enemy chipping away at your stamina, and maybe even your health, while the other lets you reposition as well as avoid attacks. More importantly though, your positioning is also crucial. On top of that, you also have to manage your stamina, your other defensive options, and actually time your attacks in between. A turn-based game like Clair Obscur simply can't have any of that. There's no decision-making or strategy to the defensive play, just staring, waiting for an attack to come, and then essentially, it's just a quick time event. It's still better than nothing. The game is better with it than without. there are few things more boring or frustrating than just watching your character slowly take damage while you can't do anything about it. But it's still just a QTE. A QTE where the prompt simply doesn't show up to tell you when to press. With all of that out of the way, in the grand scheme of things, the game becomes especially funny when contrasting its gameplay with the melodramatic story it's trying to tell. Now, don't get it twisted, there's nothing wrong with highly dramatic or even melodramatic stories like this. This is exactly what I was expecting when I first booted up this French game called Clair Obscur, after all. But that doesn't mean this kind of story will mesh well with every kind of gameplay. I, as the player, am expected to believe that all these countless expeditions, filled with hundreds of warriors of all kinds, were somehow wiped out during excursions to this continent. Yet, never outside of a cutscene have I felt threatened by anything. How exactly did these expeditions go wrong? Did they not learn to stall the enemies repeatedly by spamming their infinite ammo magic gun? Why didn't they just run and avoid all the enemies? Why didn't they select the runaway option? The reality is that a player can't be truly threatened by a setting unless the gameplay is equally threatening, but this is only in the case of forced combat sequences. And how do these occur? Well, through cutscenes. So, according to the gameplay, this is what previous expeditioners all feared. Forced cutscenes. This is how they were all killed, because surely they managed to bypass all the enemies by walking around otherwise. Well, unless they were faced with the only other dangerous threat, that is, extremely tight corridors. Which brings us to the levels themselves. Enemies aren't the only danger an unknown and perilous continent would pose. The landscape is another one. Except, of course, there's nothing threatening about this landscape because the levels don't reflect any of its possible danger. It's hard to believe that aside from forced cutscene nevrons, the expeditions had to fight anything other than the agony of walking in a straight line. The terrain seems to all have been child-proof beforehand. There's an attempt to render climbing and grappling points diegetic, with the excuse that previous expeditions were there to install them for those who come after, and this makes the environment somewhat more believable, but that effort is instantly wasted the moment you spend more time in one of these zones, and it turns into what is essentially just a linear corridor filled with invisible walls, just there to make sure you don't get stuck or don't fall off. Again, I'm supposed to believe this is where so many failed before me. To be fair, this is a result of the developer, Sandfall, knowing its limits. The studio knew it couldn't afford to make ambitiously large levels. Still, that knowledge of limitations didn't extend to the story, and so we're left with levels that any toddler can go through even if they supposedly wiped out thousands before us. This criticism might surprise some. The lack of a mini-map in these zones is a common gripe people have brought up when discussing the game. However, in reality, these levels are excruciatingly simple, straightforward, and handholdy. The blame for the disorientating nature of these areas lies on the level design and on the game's visual language, which prioritize fidelity above clarity. Now, Clair Obscur is a gorgeous game. Not only does it use the latest Unreal Engine 5 technologies in order to look wonderful, but it manages to do so without constant frame drops and awful frame pacing, which is a legitimate achievement in this day and age. Even better, the art direction deserves commendation as well. High fidelity games like these usually get away with having pretty graphics without actually being able to deliver on the art direction front, but with Clair Obscur you get both. Unfortunately, this all comes at a cost. A cost arguably greater than better performance on lower end hardware. A game's visuals affects gameplay too. Looking at Clair Obscur's busy looking environments and confused terrain, it should be pretty obvious why players get lost. It's not a consequence of the grandeur and complexity of these supposedly dangerous areas, it's the consequence of visual noise. All this running around aimlessly is probably distracting players from the fact that they're really not doing anything interesting in these areas. Outside combat, walking forward and pressing the occasional context-sensitive grappling or climbing button is all you're really doing. No amount of having to backtrack because you got lost is going to change the fact that players have no meaningful interactions within these zones. And so I keep asking myself, what was so dangerous about this continent that got so many people killed? This might sound like I'm being too harsh, but what I've just listed may all be intentional on the developer's part. At the end of Act 2, the other shoe drops. The characters, the world, the story, a painting, all of it. It was all a painted world once created by Verso, now used as an escape for the paintress Aline, and soon her daughter as well, Alicia. One could then argue this is why so many things feel off. You're supposed to suspend your disbelief because it isn't truly the real world after all. Not only is it a game, but it's a painted world in a game's world. The characters don't find it odd when they get teleported to makeshift convenient arenas whenever they enter combat, simply because that's how they believe the world works. The linear corridor-like world is then just a byproduct of this, since the world was literally made for your convenience. Not just for you the player, but for the characters as well. There's more that is affected by the occurrence of this twist, but needless to say, at least at first, it's effective. It's a shocking, well-executed turn of events. It recontextualizes the story, explains plenty of mysteries, gives answers to many questions, and sheds new light on confusing elements from the first two acts of the game. You could argue, though, that this twist answers far too many questions. Throughout the game, the player meets many enigmatic figures and populations, the Gestrals, the Grandis, the Nevrons, and more. I'm sure most players will vividly remember talking to their first non-hostile Nevron, analyzing its design, analyzing its dialogue, and pondering, what's his story? Why does it not attack me? Why does it look like that? Why does Goldblue protect this rose? Well, with this twist in mind, it's important to note that in the case of the latter, there isn't even an answer. It was a red herring, or maybe worse, set up for future downloadable content. As for every other question you might have had about the Nevrons, well, there is one singular answer. Cléa Descendre. She created the Nevrons in order to stop Chroma from returning to the Paintress. That's it. That's the answer to every single question I just asked. That's the lore of every single Nevron, and so it is the story of almost every single enemy and boss encounter in the entire game. All of this isn't necessarily a bad thing, though. Huge RPGs with rich worlds like Elden Ring and Morrowind have conditioned players to expect world building depth at every corner. Endless text just to explain why a stick can do magic. With Clair Obscur, this lack of breadth and depth is bound to have disappointed many players, including myself at first. We've come to expect fantasy RPGs to have elaborate lore, spanning hundreds of thousands of words, but the truth is that that's not inherently superior. There's an argument to be made that this makes Clair Obscur distinct. It's fairly unique because we always expect the opposite, and I can't say for sure that it's a bad thing. There's always value to be found in originality because it can often mean authenticity. And so, I can forgive and even appreciate this streamlined approach to world building since it does make the story and the world more unique. Regrettably, that's not the only issue with this twist. No, the bigger issue becomes obvious when you start playing on New Game Plus, or when you start completing optional content in Act 3 and find more Expedition audio logs, only to realize you don't want to listen to them. Because why would you? Their existence is tied to a phrase that the game seems to have long forgotten by then. For those who come after. This is reflected not just in the last act of the game, but in the endings too. You'd think that for characters that aren't Mael, learning their existence is a mere fragment of a normal person's imagination would be enough to have them have an existential crisis, similarly to Verso's. Their world might finally seem fake to them. It's just a painting after all. But none of that happens. It doesn't help that the most standard characters, Lune and Ciel, are the ones that should be the most affected by this. They should have the strongest opinions, but no, you just keep on going. I'm sure many of you will disagree with me, but one thing that's hard to argue against is how baffling the relationship system is. On the surface, there's nothing wrong with it. Talk to characters, unlock more of their story. It makes sense, but there's this completely useless number that's attached onto it, because this is an RPG, I guess. And so, we get absolutely mind-boggling moments like these, where Ciel will tell me about her suicide attempt following the death of her husband, resulting in the death of her unborn child, and then... Like... What? Nothing would change if this was removed. What could possibly be gained from having this screen in the game aside from undermining the characters? But I guess it's okay, because they're fake people after all. Some might argue they aren't. They're just as real and as important as anyone outside the painting is. But then, why doesn't the game portray it that way? Looking at Verso's ending, the worst we get is a stern look from Lune. And that's it, for what would essentially be mass genocide. The game can't have it both ways. I can't genuinely care about the characters if they're only there for Mael's escapism, or there to be all killed off in a hand wave in order to let her grieve. This metaphor just doesn't work. Escapism, as portrayed in this game, doesn't save entire civilizations from being wiped out. And so, whenever you find yourself replaying this game, why should you care? Care about the survival of this society, about the gommage, about the characters, about this world, when you know at any moment it can all be reshaped by the snap of a finger. Knowing what you know by the end, as the player, what do you feel when you see Gustave die again? My answer is obvious. I see a man that can just be resurrected. I see a man whose mere existence and lineage were easily created by one stroke of a pencil. I see a man who once represented the emotional thesis of a quest for greatness, but now his motto has long been forgotten in favor of the drama of real people. That motto is now meaningless. For those who come after, it's meaningless. Hell, when you really think about it, if Act 1 and 2, and thus the entire expedition, didn't happen at all, almost nothing about the outcome of the story would change. Maëlle would eventually get Gommage to regain all her memories, and then she would still want to stay in the canvas. She would still fight her father. The only difference is that she wouldn't have met some characters like Esquier and Monoko, but you can be certain that she would still fight for the people of Lumiere's survival. Hell, for Gustave's revival. If the goal of this twist was to shock me, only to then invalidate the first two acts of the game, then it was a resounding success. The game manages to reroad any themes of self-sacrifice in service of something more generic, but also more relatable. We completely pivot from La Horde du Contrevent, the book that inspired much of the story in Expedition 33, in favor of something completely different, which would be fine except that in this story, both are mutually exclusive, and one is given all importance at the detriment of the other. The game essentially says, this is what's real. That other stuff, it was just nonsensical fiction. Giant ticking clocks erasing populations little by little can definitely be interpreted as nonsensical fiction. Under that lens, it makes sense to abandon the ridiculous premise that was initially proposed in order to tackle something more down to earth, but I call that a missed opportunity. With a fictional setting, you can explore the human condition in ways that you couldn't otherwise, the way L'Art du Contrevent did, and the way this game so clearly attempts to do in that first act. You can use fantasy to explore dilemmas that simply wouldn't feasibly happen under the circumstances of reality. But we don't get that. Instead, we get a game about things reality is all too familiar with. Escapism and grief, and solely those two things. Clair Obscur is a game that's willing to sacrifice everything it sets up in order to make its final message abundantly clear, and I think that's a waste. The game wants to be important and profound so badly. It wants to be a big statement, one that will be remembered in the same way that the greats of the medium are. And that's admirable, but the truth is, it doesn't have anything cohesive to say. And this brings me to my final point. There's a narrative around this game in the online space right now. This narrative describes how a small indie development team of just a few people managed to make a game from nothing and show the industry what's right. Of course, the very basis of this narrative is incorrect, as Clair Obscur doesn't even qualify to be independent on even a single front. It had a publisher, A-list actors, a budget of several millions of dollars, and a total of hundreds of people working on it. But I still agree with the overall sentiment of this said narrative. Not that Clair Obscur is the greatest game to end all games, but that Sinful Interactive should be proudly hailed as an example to follow. Most big studio titles from the last 15 years have had budgets and development times ballooning so much that any kind of risk has been thrown out the window. My intention here isn't to discourage the approach Sandfall has taken, but to champion it as well as reviewing its results. I respect what Sandfall has accomplished, and this is also why I won't make any excuses for them. Games deserve to be held to a high standard, whether independent or not. Audiences should rightly cheer triumphs like these, but it's the role of critics to avoid pulling punches, to evaluate works of art on their own merits rather than not. Anyway, the irony in all of this is that as a native French speaker, this is my very first review, and it's of a French game. Yet, I'm doing it in English. This might all seem unimportant, but I'm doing it for the same reason that the game clearly blew most of its casting budget on the English voice actors, leaving the French voiceover underwhelming in comparison. It's for maximum reach. More appeal. That said, more appeal isn't worth regurgitating what everybody knows and keeps saying about a work of art in a review. I may have titled this review for those who come after the hype, but in reality, the hype for games like these can take years to wear off. It's only then that people can truly start voicing their opinions on them. The variety of opinions on these kinds of critically acclaimed and seemingly endlessly praised titles is always greater than it might seem. I'm not an outlier. When you actually want to get a general opinion on a game, make sure to look a little harder, and then, with an opinion that is solely yours, make your voice heard for those who come after the hype.